Today, I am an official candidate for the Republican nomination.
Welcome to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson, candidate for the Republican nomination for the presidency of the United States. And now, your host for Perspective 88, Yolanda Gaskins.
Welcome to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. I'm Yolanda Gaskins, joining you for the next half hour as we discuss the issues facing every American in the 1988 presidential campaign. Candidate for the Republican nomination, Pat Robertson, is a man who has solutions for some very tough questions. Now, many are saying that the greatest domestic crisis facing America is the decay of the family structure. This year alone, it's been estimated that there will be more than 1 million divorces. Hundreds of thousands of teenagers are pregnant before they become adults, and because of abortions, many lives will end before they've had a chance to begin. The American family is an institution that Pat Robertson believes in. On today's program, we'll talk about the many issues facing the American family. Ladies and gentlemen, Pat Robertson.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you for taking out time from the campaign trail to join us today.
It's good to be with you.
Let's just start off with divorce. Okay. I guess that's the most obvious reason American families are breaking up. Why do you think that there's so much divorce right now?
Number one reason is selfishness. Everybody wants to do his thing, her thing. We don't want to give in America anymore, and marriage takes giving. But, you know, this isn't a government problem. This is, in a sense, a moral problem. It's a societal problem. It's a problem of the churches and of us as individuals. But if this society is going to endure, we've got to come to a time when husbands love their wives, when wives love their husbands, and when mothers and fathers stay together in stable marriages to bring up children as law-abiding, God-fearing citizens of the United States.
And, of course, creates a whole row of other problems, like single mothers.
Right.
And supporting single mothers. And
you know, that's the fastest growing segment of poverty. We use the term the feminization of poverty. You know, when a woman gets a divorce, she drops, on average, 70% of her standard of living the minute that thing's signed, which means she is now, instead of a person with dignity, a responsible member of society, she's now a number in a welfare line looking for a welfare check. And it's a terribly heart-rending thing. Divorce is much more serious than we realize, and as a nation, we've got to strengthen that family structure.
And then there's the problem of the children. We've got a lot of children who are left alone, coming home from school with no one there. You've worked on this problem before, I know.
In the organization I found at CBN, last year we had 1 million calls for help having to do with marriages. The heartache is unbelievable. It's etched in my mind. The TV story was on another network of a little child who used to come home from school about 2 in the afternoon. His mother was still working, his father was working, and he was so terrified that he went into the closet, shut the door, and stayed there and just shook in fright till his mother came home 3 or 4 hours later. That's horrible. Not to mention the fact that kids are alone now. There's more teenage sex. There's a great deal more use of drugs, and there just isn't that responsibility. Something's got to be done about that to make available women, for women who want to stay home and look after their children, and many of them do. We've got to put tax incentives into the tax code for working mothers to stay home if they wish, or mothers who want to look after their children.
You think that's the key?
Well, it's
the tax incentive.
Well, it's a start, Yolanda. You know, I've been told that after a working woman, pays the expense of transportation, pays her taxes, pays her clothing and maybe some cosmetics, pays the lunches and the child care support, she may not net more than $1,800 to $2,000 on many of the salaries that women get today. So if we could give any kind of minimal incentive, there are a lot of women who would stay home. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't for, and I'm 100% for working women who want challenging careers. But I certainly think if a woman does the same work as a man, she should get the same pay as a man. There's no question about that.
I hardly agree with that.
Well, I figured you would.
You touched on teen pregnancy.
Yes.
That's a very serious problem. We have, as I mentioned in the open, we have so many teenagers that are having children before they even become adults, and of course they can't take care of them. That adds to the welfare rolls and creates a whole slew of problems. 1
million little children, teenagers, have babies. I heard of one welfare grandmother. She was 28 years old. She had a baby at 13. Her baby had a baby at 13. And at 28, she's a grandmother, and all 3 generations on welfare. There's something called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which is a government program that, of course, is a good thing, but it has some incentive built into it that if a young teenage girl in the inner city is in an intolerable situation, she might opt to have a child to get out of that situation because she's guaranteed an apartment, a welfare check. So we have to take that option away. We can't let pregnancy out of wedlock be an option to get on welfare.
But then again, you have to be careful not to hurt the people who really need that support.
Exactly. We've got to do something to make sure that women who have small children can stay at home with those children. I don't think that forcing women out into the workforce and leaving behind little children 1, 2, 3 years old is the way to go. The children should be at least old enough to start school before the mothers work, and even then, if we could make incentives that the women want to stay home, let's do it. I think the audience agrees.
Yeah, I think they do. Something else you mentioned just a moment ago was the drug problem. You just touched on it, but that is also another problem that it really runs across the board. You're talking all the way from teenagers to adults.
I was out in California in Bakersfield, and I was told by a law enforcement officer, he said, you know, in your speech tonight, you talked about drugs being sold to 4th graders. And he said, that's right. But he said, here, we have learned of drug use among preschoolers. Can you imagine? Little babies. You know, I believe very strongly that anybody who would waste the life of a precious little child in order to make money is guilty of murder. It's the equivalent of murder. And I would like to see laws on the books which make it very clear that if anybody is convicted of a second offense of dealing illegal drugs to juveniles, that individual should get a life sentence in prison with no chance for parole. Beyond that, the government's got to get tough on the drug factories. We've got to go out to Mexico and shut down those cocaine factories, and the Middle East and the Far East, the heroin factories, and wipe out some of those marijuana fields and shut down the drug lords in Colombia and Bolivia and these other countries. We've got to be tough and I said seal our borders. But we have a shocking drug problem. It's $120 billion a year. It's wasting our youth, and we must do something and do something about it. I'm not a spender. I'm Scottish. I don't like to spend money, but I want to spend more money on drug interdiction and drug enforcement.
We've got a lot of interested people in this audience, and I know they've got a lot of questions for you. We've just touched on some of the issues facing the American family, and when Perspective 88 returns, we are going to the streets, and we're going to ask them questions that I know you will be eager to answer. Perspective 88 returns right after this. Welcome back to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. Now, we have lots of questions from our studio audience, but first, we're going to the man on the street. Here's the first one.
The question I'd like to ask is, what are you going to do about the skyrocketing cost of health care for the elderly? We all know that even insurance has gone out of sight, but insurance doesn't pay for anything. And then people that are on Medicare, their deductible is going up and up and up, and people can't afford to be sick, so they don't go to the doctor, and I think that's just a tragedy in this day and time.
In my estimation, health care is the fastest growing segment of cost in our society. It runs about 11% of what we call as the gross national product. It's $458 billion for health care for everybody. Why is it so expensive? Number one, there hasn't been any cap by government payments, and as a result, we've moved costs up to accommodate what was available. The same thing is true with health insurance. The insurance itself has not capped and controlled costs as should have. The third thing that's causing health care to go up so fast is the wild tort liability, so-called malpractice lawsuits against doctors. The cost of malpractice insurance for an average physician is running as much as $60,000 to $100,000 a year. All of this gets passed on to the people who are the patients. Now, if government continues just to fund any arbitrary cost in health care, then the government will go bankrupt and the health care ultimately will be socialized. What we've got to do is begin cost containment in health, but the major problem that the elderly are facing today is not catastrophic health care, which is being pushed through Congress. The main problem is long-term health care, and I am totally committed to a program of making one affordable insurance available to the elderly for the long-term health care, either for nursing home care or for in-home community care, which I think is even better. Or secondly, to have a combination of local, state, and federal government assistance to the elderly who can't help themselves. And the number who are covered by insurance right now is minuscule in that regard, and I think that more than anything else is the problem. Now, granted, Medicare and Medicaid payments are going to be going up. The deductibles may be changed a little bit, but the recent catastrophic health care bill that has been passed was not the answer, and it will open up a Pandora's box of extra costs.
We've got another question from a man who is concerned about the government's involvement with housing.
Well, a lot of people have no housing, so what do you plan on doing about increasing urban development and building homes for the homeless?
We have about 4.2 million government-assisted housing units. We need about 3.9 million more to help needy people. Now, I think we ought to revisit the Tax Act and make available deductions for so-called against passive income for losses to developers in low-cost housing. That is the best way to get the private sector into the low-cost housing field, is if they can get some tax breaks. The second thing I like to do is to give vouchers to people and give the people an incentive that they can keep some of the money if they can bring the cost down. If they can get a better deal, if you will, than the government thinks they can get, well, by all means, give them some financial incentive involved in it. But that gives them the feeling that they can pick and choose among housing. But the government shouldn't be an enormous landlord. It's very wasteful. It costs enormous amounts of money, and the government just shouldn't be in this business. But at the same time, we as a nation have got to have affordable housing. It's just a part of the American dream that we have a place to live in, but it's a question of how do we get there. The best way to do it is through the private sector, using vouchers for the extremely poor who can't afford anything on their own, and making some tax incentives to others to keep the rent down so people can afford to get into those units.
Pat, wouldn't there is a possibility that the administration of a program like that could become a governmental nightmare with the paperwork? Yes. How do you think that would really work?
Well, that's why it's so much better. Give people a choice. I mean, if all you did is give somebody a check, let him have the check. Let him have the voucher. He doesn't actually get the money. He gets a voucher. Let him take the voucher to the man who owns the apartment complex or the corporation and buy the housing, or at least perhaps this is a voucher for a subsidy, so that whatever the free market price is here. The voucher would cover the difference between that and what the low rent housing was going for, so that the developer wouldn't just be stuck. But get the government administration out of it. Let it be in the private sector.
We've got another question from a man who I think is concerned, a woman who I think is concerned with her future and retirement.
What is your position on social responsibility, meaning how are you going to ensure that the programs that we have for the poor, the ill, or the less fortunate than ourselves will have money and as well as services in the future?
You know, the best answer to poverty, in my estimation, is a job and not a handout. And I believe the best answer for the long-range future of our country is to beef up the private sector and to be sure that the private sector is strong. You see, government never made a nickel of money. Government does not ever make wealth. All it does is redistribute wealth. Wealth comes from God Almighty through people in a million different enterprises, little businessmen, the working people, the coal miners, the steel workers, the entrepreneurs, the executives. All these people are the ones who make the wealth. And government has got to make an environment in which private wealth is created. And when that happens, there's enough left over, in a sense, that can go for those who are truly needy in our society. You'd be interested in this, though, that if the government sent a check to all of the needy people in America to bring them up above the poverty line to supplement their existing income, it would cost $50 billion a year. And yet in local, state, and federal poverty programs, we're spending $400 billion a year. Now, what I want to do is get the money out to the truly needy, and I want to take it out of the pockets of the bureaucrats who are sapping the programs right now.
It sounds to me like you're talking about giving everybody a piece of the American dream.
That's exactly
Really?
it. I think that's what we've got to do. Make jobs available. People want dignity. No one wants to be a number in a welfare line. People want dignity. And I think we can give that kind of an opportunity to them with a strong, robust economy. And the more the government is sapping our energies and sapping money out of the economy, the more difficult it will be to really create the jobs that we need for long-range growth.
All right, good. We've got lots of questions from our studio audience. You hear them out there. They're mumbling now, ready for you. So when we come back with Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson, we'll be going into our studio audience. Stay with us. Welcome back to Perspective 88. Now, of course, we all know that some of the best questions come not from the journalists, but from the people who are actually out there voting. And I know that there are plenty of questions. Anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Pat Robertson? There's a lady here. Excuse me. Let me bring you over here. Your name is?
Inga Height.
And your question?
I'd like to ask Pat that when he's elected to the White House, what would you do, or what is first on your list in regards to legal abortion, and will you make it a priority?
Inga, I absolutely will. The Declaration of Independence says we have a God-given right to life, and I think unborn children have a God-given right to life as well. We have 1.5 million abortions in our country every year. It's shocking. And I want to say unequivocally that I'm for a human life amendment to the Constitution. I'm for a reversal of Roe versus Wade, and I'm for putting on judges on the courts, the various courts, who are sound judges who believe in interpreting the Constitution instead of trying to rewrite it. And beyond that, I am absolutely committed to a cutoff of funds from the federal government to provide abortion services or to agencies which promote abortions. Now, I'm, of course, for family planning, but I make an absolute pledge that I would veto any appropriations bill which included even 1 dime of spending for Planned Parenthood or any other organization counseling abortion.
All right, let me see some more hands. I know there were questions. There was one right here. Sir, would you stand, please? And your name is?
My name is Eugene Del Guardio, and I know I can't call you Mr. President, but as soon as you do get into the White House, I'm a father of 5, and, excuse me, father of 3. I gained 1, 2 there. I'm worried about some of these anti-family regulations that are there from the Internal Revenue Service. You know, I have to have Social Security numbers, thanks to the IRS, for my kids that are approaching 5 years old. And this is the kind of thing I have to contend with a lot of these regulatory agencies.
Mm-hmm. 2 things in that question. Number 1, there is definitely a marriage penalty. You get a better tax break, a man and a woman who are living together without being married, than 2 people who've entered into holy wedlock. Now, that's the marriage penalty if they both work, and that's wrong. We should change the law back to what it was at least a year ago to allow some kind of consideration for married people. Secondly, I want to see a better break on tax deductions for dependents. I would like to see a deduction of about $3,000 per dependent so we'd catch up with where the inflation has been over the years. But the third thing you mentioned was this Social Security number. I don't like a population where everybody has a number and where that number is used in government regulations, in states, in localities for various privileges. Now, I'm under the impression Barry Goldwater put through a resolution through the Congress several years ago to prohibit a misuse of the Social Security number. But I don't want us to have some kind of birth-to-death number that follows us. And I've been told that the IRS is right now compiling dossiers on every American that would have their education, their age, their earning capacity, the kind of house they live in, the clubs they belong to, their wives, their children, and all this information socially, financially, educational about them to assess taxes. I think that smacks of Nazism. It doesn't smack of the great American republic that I know and love.
We've got a lot more questions up here in the audience, but we're going to take a break now, and we'll be coming back with Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson right after this message. This is Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. We, during the break, had a lot of questions from our audience. Obviously, they have a lot of interest in this campaign, and that's really good to see. And you are going to be back out on the road all the time campaigning.
All the time, talking to many people. But, you know, as we've considered these family issues, Yolanda, I really believe this is getting to be the #1 issue in America. People are very concerned about family breakup. We're looking at millions of lives being shattered. And people know that if America is going to be strong, we must support the American family. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren to give them the same kind of wonderful nation that has been given to us, the same kind of freedoms. But the absolute essential to freedom is self-restraint. And if we do not restrain ourselves, then somebody will come along to restrain us. And we won't particularly like that. We must go back to some of the basics, the moral foundations, the love, the concern, the care that we've known in the past. And if there's one thing we can do in America is to make a commitment in 1988, this 200th anniversary of the election of the first president of the United States, George Washington, to say, as Americans, we are going to uphold the family unit. We're going to recognize that there is certain moral decay in our nation. We can't have a drug epidemic. We can't have 30% of the people being touched by alcoholism. We can't have millions and millions of divorces. We can't continue the slaughter of the unborn. We have to have a commitment to life and to dignity and to love in our nation. And many of these things are things that government can't do. We can rectify some of the problems. We can enforce some conduct. But basically, it's an issue that's in your hands. It's we the people, not we the government. Yolanda?
I think I'm supposed to... I don't think I'm supposed to be applauding you. I'm supposed to be impartial, but that was wonderful. We wish you a lot of luck in the campaign, and thank you so much for joining us here today on the show.
It's been wonderful being with you. I hope we get together again. Thank you.
Pat Robertson.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's program. If you'd like more information for yourself or to share with a friend, we've put together a free cassette called What I Will Do as President by Pat Robertson. You'll hear more ideas on topics that concern you, your family, our country, and the world. Please call your local Robertson for President headquarters at the number on your screen and ask for the free audio cassette of What I Will Do as President. And thank you again for listening.